The story of Piers Gaveston's end is pure nightmare fuel. A king's favorite captured by his enemies and subjected to unspeakable tortures before finally being granted the mercy of a beheading. It's a tale of medieval brutality that's been told for centuries, a grisly footnote in the tragic reign of King Edward II. It paints a picture of a man broken by agony, a symbol of how quickly fortunes could turn in the violent world of 14th century politics. We imagine him in a dark dungeon, jeered at by his captors, his body savaged by cruel instruments, his spirit crushed long before the axe fell. This is the version of history that has echoed through the ages, sensational, horrific, and unforgettable. But it's also a lie. The truth is, there was no documented torture. The real story of Piers Gaveston's death is one of a swift, calculated, and completely illegal political execution. This wasn't about inflicting pain for fun. It was about the cold, hard removal of a political problem. The story is a conspiracy hatched by the most powerful men in England to eliminate a rival they simply could not tolerate. And the reasons why this myth of torture was created and why the truth was buried are far more scandalous than the fiction itself. The reality of a clinical, brutally efficient assassination is a tale not of wanton cruelty, but of raw, unshakable political fear, and a king's love so profound it would shake the very foundations of the English throne. To understand why Piers Gaveston had to die, you first have to understand how he lived, and more importantly, how he rose. Born around 1284, he was the son of a loyal Gascon knight in the service of King Edward I. From this respectable but relatively humble background, nobody could have predicted he would become the most powerful and most hated man in England besides the king himself. His journey began in 1300 when, as a teenager, he was assigned to the household of the heir to the throne, Prince Edward. The two, both around 16, formed an immediate and intense bond. So, what exactly was their relationship? That's a question historians still debate. Were they lovers, as many chroniclers have hinted? Or was it a bond of sworn brotherhood? A pact of loyalty not so unusual between men of the military class back then? One contemporary wrote that the moment the prince saw Gaveston, he felt such love for him that he entered into a covenant of constancy with a bond of indissoluble love. Edward himself called Gaveston my brother Piers. Whether it was romantic or fraternal, their bond was absolute, exclusive, and to the English nobility, deeply alarming. This bond was put to the test long before Edward became king. The old king, Edward I, a truly formidable warrior, grew furious about his son's closeness to the flamboyant Gascon. In one infamous incident, Prince Edward asked his father to grant Gaveston a title. The king supposedly exploded in a rage, tore out handfuls of his son's hair, and banished Gaveston from the kingdom. It was a clear warning. It was also a warning that was completely ignored. When Edward I died in July 1307, everything changed. One of the very first acts of the new king, Edward II, was to recall his beloved Piers from exile. And he didn't just bring him back, he showered him with honors on a scale that was just staggering. Gaveston was made Earl of Cornwall, a title of immense wealth and prestige normally reserved for royals. This was an unthinkable promotion for the son of a minor knight, and it sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. He was given the king's own niece, Margaret de Clare, as a bride, plugging him directly into the web of high nobility. When Edward traveled to France for his own wedding, he left Gaveston in charge of England as regent. At the coronation, Gaveston was given the honor of carrying the crown, dressed so magnificently that one observer noted he more resembled the god Mars than an ordinary mortal. Gaveston's personality didn't help matters. By all accounts, he was arrogant, witty, and had a razor-sharp tongue he used to mock the great lords of the realm. He gave them insulting nicknames. The powerful Earl of Warwick was the Black Dog of Arden, and the Earl of Lancaster, the king's cousin, was the Fiddler. He loved his access to the king, forcing powerful earls to kneel before him to get anything done. To the English barons, this was more than an insult. It was a total disruption of the political order. They saw a second king, an upstart foreigner who had bewitched their monarch and stolen their rightful place. The problem wasn't just that the king had a favorite. The problem was that this favorite was a political monopolist. You can probably guess that this didn't go over well. The resentment simmering among the nobility soon boiled over into organized opposition. This wasn't just about hurt feelings, it was a full-blown constitutional crisis. The barons, led by the formidable Thomas, Earl of Lancaster, saw Gaveston's influence as a direct threat to the kingdom. Lancaster was the king's cousin, a man of immense wealth and royal blood, and he became the leader of a faction determined to curb the king's power and, above all, get rid of Piers Gaveston for good. Their first major victory came in 1308 when they pressured the king to exile Gaveston again. Edward reluctantly agreed, but he softened the blow by making Gaveston the Lord Lieutenant of Ireland, a position of serious authority, not the punishment the barons wanted. And this exile, like the first, didn't stick. Edward spent the next year negotiating and essentially refusing to govern until his brother was allowed to return. In 1309, he got his wish. Gaveston was back and reportedly more arrogant than ever. This defiance pushed the barons to take a more drastic step. In 1310, they forced the king to agree to a committee of 21 powerful men known as the Lords Ordainers. Their job was to draft a set of sweeping reforms for the kingdom. The result, published in 1311, was the Ordinances, a radical set of rules designed to put the king on a leash. They declared that the king couldn't go to war, grant lands, or even leave the country without Parliament's consent. But at the very heart of the document was Ordinance 20, a clause aimed squarely at one man. It condemned Piers Gaveston by name, declaring him an enemy of the people and decreeing he be exiled for a third time. This time, the terms were final. If he ever returned, he would be treated as an outlaw, to be killed on sight. The barons' hatred was now the law of the land. Faced with a united front, a horrified Edward had no choice but to agree. In November 1311, Gaveston left England. The barons thought they'd finally won, but they had profoundly underestimated Edward's devotion. For the king, a promise made under threat wasn't a promise at all. By January 1312, less than 2 months later, Gaveston was back in England. Edward immediately declared the judgment against him illegal and restored all his titles. This was the final straw. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the barons and a declaration that the king was above the law. For the barons, it confirmed their worst fears. As long as Gaveston was alive, he would always be a threat. The conspiracy now shifted from political maneuvering to military action. The legal options were gone. The conflict would now be settled by force, leading to a kingdom-wide manhunt for the man who had dared to defy them all. The year 1312 kicked off with England on the edge of civil war. King Edward and Piers Gaveston were effectively fugitives in their own kingdom, hunted by the private armies of the barons. Led by Thomas of Lancaster, the coalition moved fast. In May, they nearly cornered the royal party at Newcastle. Edward and Gaveston had to flee so quickly they left behind a trove of treasure and supplies in a humiliating escape by sea. They found refuge at Scarborough Castle, where the king made a fateful mistake. He left Gaveston to hold the fortress while he went to York to raise an army. This separated the two and left Gaveston vulnerable. The Earls of Pembroke and Surrey immediately laid siege to the castle. While Scarborough was strong, Gaveston was unprepared and outnumbered. On May 19, 1312, he surrendered. The terms of surrender, negotiated with the Earl of Pembroke, were surprisingly fair. Gaveston would be held in custody until Parliament could meet and work out a final deal with the king. Crucially, Pembroke gave his personal oath, pledging his own life and lands that Gaveston would be kept safe. It seemed a peaceful resolution was still on the table. Pembroke started escorting Gaveston south, stopping at a rectory in Deddington. Here, Pembroke made a critical error. He left Gaveston under guard to visit his wife nearby. Was this a massive blunder or a deliberate betrayal? We'll never know. But it gave another, more ruthless enemy his chance. Enter Guy de Beauchamp, the Earl of Warwick, the black dog of Arden Gaveston had once mocked. He descended on the rectory, seized Gaveston, and dragged him back to his own stronghold, Warwick Castle. Pembroke's honor was shattered. At Warwick, the end came quickly. There was no real trial. An assembly of the main conspirators, Lancaster, Warwick, and others, convened and summarily condemned Gaveston to death for violating the ordinances. On June 19, 1312, Piers Gaveston was led from Warwick Castle to Blacklow Hill, a piece of land that just so happened to belong to the chief conspirator, Thomas of Lancaster. The chronicles don't speak of torture chambers or prolonged agony. They speak of a swift, brutal, and extrajudicial killing. They took him to the hill where two of Lancaster's men were waiting. One ran him through with a sword, and the other hacked off his head. His body was simply left there. Later, Dominican friars collected the remains, sewed the head back on, and took it to Oxford. The political problem of Piers Gaveston had been solved. So why does the myth of torture persist? Why has history clung to this lurid fiction? The answer comes down to propaganda and the politics of memory. The execution of Piers Gaveston was murder, plain and simple. It was an illegal act carried out by a mob of nobles against the king's express will. In the years that followed, it served the interests of their enemies to paint the act as even more monstrous, framing the barons not as enforcers of justice, but as bloodthirsty tyrants. And let's be honest, for storytellers, a tale of gruesome torture is just more dramatic than a straightforward political hit. But the fiction hides a more scandalous truth, that a group of the most powerful men in England were so threatened by one man's influence that they were willing to commit treason to get rid of him. They didn't torture him because they weren't driven by sadism. They executed him because they were driven by cold political necessity. The real scandal wasn't medieval brutality. It was the terrifying fragility of royal power when faced with a united aristocracy. The truth is that Edward II's love for Gaveston and Gaveston's own arrogance created a crisis so deep that it could only be ended with a sword. King Edward II was left heartbroken and filled with a desire for vengeance that would consume him for the next decade, eventually leading him to execute Thomas of Lancaster in 1322. The death of Piers Gaveston didn't bring peace. It lit the fuse on years of conflict, civil war, and eventually, the king's own horrifying death. The clean blow of the executioner's sword on Blacklow Hill didn't end the story. It was only the beginning. If you found this look into the real story of Piers Gaveston's death compelling, be sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more deep dives that separate historical myth from reality. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode. And now I have a question for you. Does knowing that Gaveston wasn't tortured, but was the victim of a calculated political assassination, change how you see the powerful barons who opposed him, or King Edward II's tragic reign? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below.